Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover on the show, feel free to email us at fromnowheretonothingpodcast@gmail.com or contact us on our Facebook page. After discussing nihilism last week and the implications of a lack of meaning, today we'll look at what constitutes the social institutions we participate in throughout our lives. While these two themes don't seem directly related at first glance, the truth is that various flavors of nihilism have contributed to human institutions throughout recent history. What effects does this philosophy and others have on how we organize and conduct our societies and ourselves? Listen in as we explore institutional foundations.
You know, I was thinking, I didn't send this to you because it was an audio clip from NPR, but there was a discussion this week, I think midweek, about nihilism and how it is used by people with sometimes fascistic intent, because people who say they don't believe in anything are those who are most manipulable into a new kind of institution or social order. It was a very interesting discussion, and it gelled with what we were talking about. But there is a definite connection between the two things.
Yeah, that's really interesting because like we were talking about last week, and like I mentioned in the intro, this is really a 3-part series what we're doing here, but the 3 parts don't seem to be. If I think that if we didn't mention it was a series, probably the listeners wouldn't think that anything of it.
Like the middle 3 Star Wars movies.
Yeah, there's nothing.
Jab.
Right. So, yeah, last week we talked about nihilism and, essentially the philosophy that, there's a lack of meaning in things. This week we're talking about institutional foundations. And I'm thinking probably the majority of this discussion is going to revolve around political institutions. But, I think that that's because there's some overlap, but there is some differences when we look at businesses or religious institutions or purely social institutions on how they function. So we'll probably get into those details a little bit. But let's start by saying, what will we be talking about when we discuss institutional foundations?
I think for many people, when you say the word institution, you're thinking of a structure, maybe a bricks and mortar structure. And the etymology of this one is interesting because it too it's not ancient. A word that first gets used in the 1300s, first French and then beyond, regarding the church, the Catholic Church. But the word itself in French essentially means foundation, something established. And so it's vague. Let's see, it's a disposition towards something. It's an arrangement. And then it starts getting applied to very specific institutions. So the church being the foundation of social structure or that kind of thing. Education, politics, corporate world. There are so many institutions that we can talk about.
Yeah, and I think that the thing that's interesting about it, that I'm sure we'll talk about as we get further on, is that these things, much like a lot of things we look at in philosophy, these aren't sort of siloed categories, right? Your overarching political environment has a strong effect on your educational environment, your religious environment, especially, back in the Middle Ages or during the Renaissance, had a huge impact on your political environment. Your business environment is impacted by, so right. All of these things are interconnected in some way or another, and each one has its own idiosyncratic qualities as well.
So by the 1800s, you get into a place where the word institution in a colloquial sense means something that's been around for a while. something that's appointed, something that's established. But the appointed starts sounding governmental. I appoint you to do this. I appoint you to do that. Yes, it just keeps shifting.
So, where do institutional foundations come from?
I hesitate about him, but it's because life is so always complicated. One of the philosophers who most dedicated himself, he's, I think, 91 now, but to talking about this in the 60s and 70s, his earlier work is a man named John Searle. And I don't know if you encountered him in your researches for this, but he was talking about language as he was following Wittgenstein, and he was talking about language as the necessary structure without which there couldn't be institutions. And he was so he's sort of blending philosophy and sociology in a very complicated way. I'm not going to try to go all through that because it would be a dry lecture, and we don't want to do that. But it's problematic because John Searle eventually lost his faculty emeritus status in his 80s because of a number over the 21st century, a number of accusations of inappropriateness with female graduate students and so on, and which deeply saddens me, outrages me, on behalf of those students, and they spoke up and things happened eventually. Still doesn't diminish the work in the 60s, I think, and the 70s that he was doing about language, categorizing how we use language, and that mirrors what we do in institutions.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because, when we think about where do institutional foundations come from, I think that the question it raises is, are they naturally occurring or are they social constructs? Right.
And I think I would go with the latter, that they are definitely constructs that we build. This is where it gets really dicey, because we build these constructs seemingly to make certain that we have established, there's that word, freedoms or rights. But we also have rules by which we are supposed to proceed with our lives. The institutions, those who establish institutions, all of the people who are in the muddy process of establishing an institution set up those rules. And so it creates, artificially constructs a social order. And it's not necessarily the right social order, because every institution is made up of human beings, and therefore it's flawed. If I skip to the chase, skip to the end of it and come back, in my experience and my thinking about this through a life of teaching and engaging with all kinds of institutions, all institutions eventually fail. They get severely tested. They fail. Some of them succeed and fail together, but many institutions lose sight of what their purpose was in the start, and they don't have to stay the way they were hundreds of years ago. They shouldn't, because that's not going to last. But there are some institutions that take as their first principle that they need to grow and grow. And when your first principle is growth, you necessarily lose sight of what your mission was.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of reading on mythology recently, and sort of the structure of, myths around the world and stuff. And that's sort of a trope that kind of runs through some of them, is this idea that, everything has a life cycle, like a human being, right? And even this sort of, for lack of a better word, mysticism has started to become infused into scientific frameworks in new physics, right? Which isn't to say that it's baseless, but physicists are looking at the universe and saying, well, really, the universe had a beginning, we know, and it will likely have an end, so it has a lifespan, and life itself will have a lifespan, right? It couldn't have existed in the early parts, and at some point in the future, it will be impossible for it to exist. And consciousness, even the abstraction of consciousness, has a lifespan, right? It has arisen, and we don't know if humans are, or mammals, or whatever you want to say, were the first things to become conscious, or where the last things in the universe to become conscious are. But everything has a lifespan, and and the stories, the fables and myths and things that we tell ourselves tend to have symbolic representations of that.
Yes, they do.
And I think that is, a lot of them are sort of cautionary tales for institutions, that say, listen, the old king or whoever, he starts out with a good intention, trying to bring order to the kingdom, but then he sort of strangles the kingdom with overwhelming order, and then a new hero has to rise up to take him down. These sorts of things.
You know the aphorism, if the hero lives long enough, he lives long enough to become the villain.
Mm-hmm.
So this is very interconnected. When we talked about all of the Aesop fables that we chose to discuss, Aesop fables, in a sense, are an institution, or were. These are the stories we go for. The moral. People just want the moral. What's the line? We had lovely discussions about that. If you just cut into the chase for the moral, you don't need the story, because the story is going to keep instructing you and be fresh if you think about it. But it's that thinking that's required. The institutions are normative, and what that means is they establish cultural or societal norms, the baseline expectations of behavior, and then but then that goes down a micro chain and up into a macro chain of, okay, so businesses now, they love the rhetorical stance of saying, the culture of this company is okay. So now we can think biologically. We know what clusters of cultures do inside of our own bodies. The culture of the institution. That means the institution says it's distinguishing itself from all other institutions. But just as a point of illustration, almost every school will say that its values are unique to its community. And you look down through its list of bullet pointed values, and they are precisely the same ones as the community 20 miles away or 1,000 miles away.
Yeah.
We're different than everybody else, except we're not. And so these norms, this normative function of social institutions is about organizing beliefs and behavior. Okay, and once you start saying, well, this is what we need in order to survive, then you start, well, now that we've survived, so what we need to flourish. Now, let's go back to just surviving. We don't want people to flourish, because flourishing, that's messy, and we can't control it as much. And that's when institutions get, or are made to, do the things which they aren't doing at their best. And yes, I won't mention names because everybody knows what I'm talking about, but when you if you have the power as a governmental figure to go in and tear a university apart, a university is an institution. It grows out of the culture of the people it is hired to work, who are specialists in their fields, who know the things that people ought to know and to question and to change as it goes on. You come in and you intrude and you say, no, lopping this off, lopping that off. Why? Because I don't like it. Why? Because I don't find it moral. Why? Because it upsets my values. Well, okay, then you're engaging in an act of violence. It's intellectual violence. It's lobotomizing a place that was, for the most part, thriving. And when authoritarian influences do this kind of thing, they are countering what might be the only natural process. The evolution of an individual becomes the evolution of the institutions that individuals build. And when your primary purpose is to tear things down and block things off, you use whatever metaphor you want. An institution has a natural growth, but an institution gets concentrated totally on its growth, then it gets unhealthy. But an institution will change, but it will change of its own accord.
Yeah. All right, man. There's so many things.
There's
so many things that are going on now in my head that are really cool. But I think that the big the point we should focus on early in the discussion here that I think is cool is that there's this tension arising between the nihilism that we talked about last week, which posits that there's no meaning in anything, versus the overemphasis on meanings and morals as being static, never changing things, like what you were just talking about, adjusting policy in a tyrannical way because things must stay the same, or the morals in Aesop's fables, right? Where we say, well, what's the moral? And we don't care about what the story is, rather than looking at the story itself and letting it tell us that. So there's this tension between no meaning and meaning as this static thing.
Absolutist meaning,
And I think that that's where, for the foundations of institutions, that's a very interesting thing to focus on. Yep. So who are some of the early thinkers of institutional design?
It's interesting because there's so many different ways you can approach that, because institutional design, and I'm not hedging the question, it's just you can talk about architectural, when you're talking about, again, stones, bricks, mortar, whatever, that the design of a space in which an institution will flourish is integral to what the values of that institution are. This is what architects are about. So first, in a general sense, I'm going to say architects.
Yeah, and I think that's an often overlooked aspect of it, because if you think about it, when you had this Greek revival architecture, right, with the pillars and with these other things, that makes you feel something when you walk into that building, versus a lot of people don't know this, but the man who was responsible for designing many of the public schools in the United States in the 1970s was the same man contracted to design the prisons for the United States prison system. So if you drive past a lot of the schools that were made in that time frame, the 1970s, you go, the only difference between this school and a prison is a barbed wire fence around the outside, right? And you go, well, how does that affect children going in? And then you think about what kids have thought about school in the decades that have gone on since then. And by and large, a lot of the responses have been this sort of feeling of entrapment, or this feeling of forcing, being forced to be there. The idea of this discovery or open discussion that you might, if you had a Greek revival architecture, right? You can't do that everywhere, but you think about Plato talking about the Republic, or Aristotle in his Politics, right? These were the initial institutional designs.
Institutional designs, exactly. Yeah. So we go back to the old ones again, right? But then we hop up forward into the 20th century with Michel Foucault, who talked about, to the consternation of many, the panopticon, the design of a prison such that there would need to be one or two or three people to run the prison because of the way it was designed. It's very complicated. I can't do it justice sitting here in the space of some seconds, but that's a really glaring example when you suggest whopping change. Now, in educational institutions, schools, because you brought it up, I can't name the group or organization that did this, but I worked within a space for a while. There's a school design process called open concept. And what that meant was that you didn't have walls with lockable doors. You had not barriers even, partial walls. So there was space between the ceiling and the walls were sort of carpeted, and it afforded some possibilities. It also was kind of difficult because you could hear the sounds from everywhere, and so the cacophony, even though it was perhaps controlled, still was an interfering into the process of going on in an individual classroom. But it was attempted. For the most part, it went away, but not everywhere. And the great thing is that people keep trying different designs. How should I? Some places, computer services in any institution is a smaller institution within it. How do we set up a computer lab in order to best advance the point, which was in the college or high school, and then not an entertainment spot, but how do we best learn about using computers? What's the most humanistic way of using these mechanistic tools? And that's an institutional decision. And if it's a top-down decision, computer services gets to tell you how you're going to use it and what tools you're going to use, sanctioned by the upper echelon of administration. In some places, faculty are approached first and say, if we were going to be considering redesign, what would you like to see in this space from a pedagogical teaching viewpoint? And so that's an institution being flexible and talking to the people who are actually doing the work.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, on our architecture, you think about religious institutions as well, and sort of the arc of architecture has played in the physical buildings of those throughout time.
Gothic cathedrals.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole point is to have the weight of the heavens up there in the shadows, sometimes with classic art, evoking God and the angels looming over you and reducing you to the size you really are by the expansiveness of the building. It's amazing.
Yeah. And, and that again creates an interesting tension, right? Because you can see how there could be a genuine, authentic inspiration of awe or the sublime, but you can also see how there could be a manipulation of sensory perceptions in order to use power to control a group of people, which happened significantly during the time that these types of buildings flourished.
Yes, that's the tension.
So we've talked about architecture. Why don't we go to that time period, or a little beyond that? We'll go to the Enlightenment, right? You have Rousseau and Locke and those. What did they say about kind of institutional design?
Well, part of the impetus of that time was to draw out, whether idealistically or realistically, to try to assert an institutional priority of maintaining individual rights. What's a government supposed to do? We talked about this once. What is the government's role to just stop us from being barbaric and tearing ourselves apart with the red tooth and claw of human nature? Is it to balance the state? The state is to help balance the individual and say, here, flourish, but we'll make sure that you're safe enough so you can flourish. Or is it to have a police state that says, don't flourish too much, flourish within the ways we say that you can, or else we're going to get you. That's reductively simplistic, but that's really what Locke and Rousseau and many of their peers were talking about. What is the role of this institution?
Yeah, kind of broadly put under the term of a social contract, right?
Yeah.
What is the relationship between the will of the people and the institutions that they themselves bring up to government? And
institutions are of that kind, of the social contract kind. The work of Rousseau was remarkably, and Locke, embedded in what our own founders were thinking about. They were making up institutions out of whole cloth, but not entirely out of whole cloth, because they were saying, well, we're not going to be a kingdom, because we've all lived with kingdoms, right? But somehow power is a very, very difficult and amorphous concept. And so what do we do to satisfy? What kind of thing do we set up? And so they essentially set up a system that was not going to move rapidly. It almost moved too slowly to get set up in the first place, and came perilously close to not working. But you're integrated into that whole system, built in, is debate, discussion, compromise. Take your time, think about this, talk about it, not talking at people, talking with people. We've all but lost that. It's still there. The social institutions are dangling by a thread, but they're functioning right now because there isn't talking with. There's talking at. So the talking at is a defiance of what was intended. And so it's of course the institutions that were built for compromise and discussion are going to be way off kilter. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that we see this. I think that a good example of some of this is looking at other institutions, even besides governments, right? Because I think that we're seeing it happen some with business, right? After post-pandemic, right? I think the businesses, by and large, are more centralized institutions than many others. You know, there's not a lot of democracy in a business, right? You have a president and an owner and a general manager and you know, a CEO, these people that sort of centralize power and then delegate down rather than having any input from the bottom up. And we've had unions in the past that have helped collectively bargain and sort of present the will of the group. And again, I'm not for or against either model, because I think that there's cases where the centralized power oppresses the workers, and there's cases where the collective bargaining protects people that shouldn't be protected, right? So there's strengths and weaknesses to either way, but I think that what we're seeing happening now in the business environment as a whole in the United States is there's kind of being a bit of a rebellion among the workers at the bottom. They're saying, no, we don't want to do this anymore. And now you're going to have to listen to us, you know? And so it's interesting to look at different institutions and see how centralized power is versus how democratized it is. And religious institutions are another one where you go, well, by and large, in those institutions, you have a doctrine that is established, that is immutable. And there's really not any, you know, there's little room for discussion or for modification from the bottom, you know. Whereas governments, on the other hand, really almost no matter how centralized your government power is, it's not going to survive if you completely deface the people, right? You'd have, no matter how tyrannical you are, it's hard to develop the amount of military power and might that can just hold down the mass of the people.
And when you do that, and when you try, and it's been done, I mean, we've seen it in history. We see it in history now. When when that's become the priority, the control, well, then other institutions falter and die on the vine and shred, and because so much is concentrated on that idea of control. Because, okay, so I'm trying to, this is so sweeping. This is a good discussion. I love this, but it's so, we have a situation where we have institutions that are functioning, law and justice systems, taking on step by step in appropriate fashion as was designed in indicting people for seeming crimes. That's how it's supposed to work. But when you have forces within a government itself that says, nope, that doesn't apply to me. That's not how it works. All these rules, nope, we're ignoring them because we know. That's extremely dangerous. And that's what's putting us on the precipice now. That's what the institutions are still functioning. But if this were in Star Trek, it's like the structural integrity is down to 30%, Captain. And somehow in the starship, it always just went right back up again. The Klingons stopped firing. And they go, oh, we're back to 100% structural. Would that were. But I think that trying to sweep in everything you were just talking about, there are so many smaller institutions within a larger one. It is not unlike a human body. And I think even people like Rousseau were thinking about that. They didn't have the biological, but I think it's, systems within systems.
Yeah, and so this leads into the next question pretty well, which is there a meaning or framework that underlies human institutions, right? And here's where the nihilism conversation from last week comes in, right?
Yeah.
And the human body is a good example for this, right? Because if I go, well, there's no meaning to my existence, right? And if you think about it, a lot of empiricist and reductionist scientific paradigms use this example, right? Our classical physics say, okay, well, there is no God. There's no any meaning for any of this. So it's just mechanistic, right? The Big Bang happened. And if we knew all of the conditions, we'd be able to predict everything. And everything up and through this conversation that we're having, right, is inevitable because of the way that things proceeded from those initial conditions. So therefore, there's no meaning. But then rationally, right, logically, you and I look at it and we go, well, every single second, my cells are using 10 trillion ATP molecules for energy with a highly advanced, systematized paddle that must have taken, billions of years of evolution, all this. The low amount of entropy in the systems that we observe make us go, wait a minute, well, if I dumped a bucket of pennies out and they all came up heads up, that'd be pretty suspicious. But if I kept doing it over and over again, right, you go, well, maybe there is a meaning underlying that. Yeah. And I'm not getting into the big metaphysical issues here of God and all of that. But for our discussion here with framework, right, if we go, well, there's no meaning to the human body, you go, well, then why would the human body exist, right? All of those subsystems, those things that you talked about, our bacteria, our cells, our neurons, all of those things developed in a certain way to accomplish a certain task, thereby implying a meaning, right? So do our social institutions have an underlying meaning? Did they develop and coalesce in the ways that they do because of something that is a framework that's beneath them?
I still think it's primarily constructed through the desires of the people who are building the framework. Edward O. Wilson, Dawkins, it's scientists, cognitivists, biologists, physicists, who will say, well, yeah, our meaning is reproduction. We reproduce. Why? So that we can keep going. Why? Because that's what our machine bodies do. I think there's more to it than that, but I'm sloshy that way, and I don't feel like I have to defend it necessarily. But I don't think there's an ultimate meaning that is cast onto us by something beyond us. I don't see any reason to. That's where I am. But Edward O. Wilson, marvelous writer. The real problem of humanity is the following. He says, this is a quotation. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And it is terrifically dangerous, and it is now approaching a point of crisis overall. Because our evolution of our emotions, what we know of Neanderthals, what we know of the Paleolithic age, what we intuit, we aren't all that different emotionally, probably, than people 100,000 years ago. We've talked about this 100,000 thing. There's some coinage, there's some writing, there's some social grouping to stay safe. There's things that are more complicated than probably should have happened. So it doesn't mean we don't change. But humanity seems to always, when things are changing, say, nope, I want to go back to whatever was. I want to go back to that perfect time when everything was just in balance. There was rose scent in the air all the time, and everybody knew their place. Well, when you know your place, that means there is a place. And if there is a place, that means there's a hierarchy. And that hierarchy has been constructed by social intent. And social intent with human beings, most of the time, is to control other people and therefore to assert a will that says, we got the right thing. You just go along with how we're doing it.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I think that if we can look to nature and see that there are other animals that have social institutions, right? Mostly mammals. And it's usually just one. They don't have the multi-layered, things that humans have. But you have one social institution with a hierarchy. And you can look at that and say, okay, well, what's the meaning of that institution? And the meaning of that is the survival of the group and reproduction, that sort of things. So that's probably the bedrock of human social institutions. But then they've progressed throughout time, right? And they've branched out into religious institutions and educational institutions, political institutions. And they're developing over time, right? Till in the modern times, you would like to believe that everybody's ideal of an institution would be equality and, personal freedoms and, security and these sorts of things that are idealistic. But where does the meaning for those come from, right? Because like you said, whenever those institutions make a misstep in their progression or evolution, the instinct of people is always to look to the old structure of the institution, the primeval one, right? And say, well, we wish things were back the way that they were. What is the underlying tension there that causes us to want to say things were better back then, even though we have this intellectual capacity to say, well, this is what we actually want in the future idealistically. This is the change that we want. This is what we're trying to accomplish. But just because there was a misstep, we want to go backwards.
I think we collectively are desperately afraid that we will have to treat everyone equally. I think we're desperately afraid that people who are radically different than ourselves have the same rights that we do. We don't want to say it. Some of us in our collectivity want to disappear them and make them gone because they don't want people to be equal. The more you assert that you want equality, and by setting more and more rules, you're going to achieve it, the more you're denying the very fact of what you say you want to achieve. What's Princess Leia say in Star Wars when Darth Vader has her really close, diminutive little Princess Leia? The more you squeeze our systems, the more will slip through your fingers.
Yeah. So I think that's a good point, right? Rather than looking at just an animal social institution as being one thing, it's really not. Really, you have one social institution per tribe, per group. And so the integration of these tribes or groups into one thing creates an issue because one is always viewing the other as the other, the capital O other, right? Yep. And that's sort of not the downfall yet, but the struggle with human institutions is this sort of non-existent, but, primal sort of, delineation of the other. So how does institutional foundations affect our free will and autonomy? So what we were just talking about, right? This idea that everybody should be equal, we could consider that moral, right? And again, our discussion of nihilism last week can come in here. But so I think that if you polled a lot of people, they say, and you said, is treating people equally a stance on morality? I think a lot of people would say yes. Do our institutions have the ability to affect our morals in a way to say, no, people shouldn't be treated equal? Or do they have to couch it in terms that make it appear as equality while actually maintaining an inequality or discrimination?
I think it's that. I mean, there are plentiful people now who don't want people to consider history. Well, when you erase history, then you get to say whatever you want, right? It's a classic move. It's a classic, and so institutions can be formidable if people who are afraid of history and knowledge know that that's going to be developed. Well, let's corporatize an institution, an educational institution. Let's just make it about the money. Let's measure success by how much you might make in a paycheck once you graduate from a college, let's say. But success is about what you make in your paycheck, not about history. History is frightening to people, and we take things for granted because we don't remember our own history. Just talking about our country, and I'm not trying to stir all. It's just we got to go somewhere, right? Like, there was no United States. There were no sets of institutions making the United States. This was a country that many other people lived in, and therefore, by their presence, owned. Our ancestors moved in, plentiful ancestors, complex ways. We weren't going to go into all that now because some of us know the story, and took over and smashed and controlled and shut down and killed swaths of human beings and took their institutions away because ours were better, because this should be our place. This land is your land, this land is my land, but it's not somebody else's land that it used to be. And when we don't think about that, we think, well, our institutions are wonderful. The United States will last forever. We just believe in all of these things. And we don't think about what that arose from and what that was built on. Then we cannot have healthy institutions that continue to grow, that teach us humility, that teach us what have we learned from our mistakes. That's what institutions should be doing, not let's perpetuate the same old thing. Here's another one of those truisms. If you always do what you always did, you always get what you always got. Yeah. That doesn't work in a dynamic company, does it?
No.
And it doesn't work for people who, I know that I shouldn't adjust my diet at all because I like my diet and that's what it is. And it doesn't matter whether I'm 20 or I'm 60 or I'm 80. I can just eat the same things in the same amounts in the same ways. Well, sure, you can. You're not going to get the same results.
Yeah. So, no, I think that's an important illustration because, we talk about the American government a lot as if it were just this thing that
always existed.
Right. And part of the reason we think that is because, the political and educational systems that are in place don't really emphasize the fact that we took somebody else's land and that those people are now living on reservations, right? We have sort of corralled them into these,
And the institutions that do that are the ones that are targeted. No, you can't say that. No, you can't teach that. No, knowledge is dangerous. Yeah. Knowledge is power.
Right. So this idea of whether our foundations can affect our autonomy or free will, I think that the classic case study of that in the 20th century is Nazi Germany, right? You look at that and what what has been said about it that really strikes the main chord, right, is that lots of people look at that time frame and those people and they go, yeah, they were monsters, they were animals, but they weren't. They were human beings, right? The Nazis were human beings, just like you or I, that were manipulated into doing these terrible things. They're autonomous, which isn't to say that they weren't complicit. They were definitely complicit. But the ability of an institution to manipulate people into acting a certain way shouldn't be underestimated. And I think that we can all look at our own institutions. We have listeners all around the world. So there's a plethora of different governments,
absolutely,
different religions, different social institutions that each have their own effect on how our listeners perceive their identity, their sense of, their free will. I won't put it in quotations necessarily, but half quotes, we'll say. Where, we all make decisions, but at the same time, we're all inclined or canted towards a certain way of viewing things, towards a certain way of behavior. And it requires critical thinking and really examining something in order to break out of that. And so, of course, Nazi Germany is kind of that example. Do you think something like that could happen again? Or do you think that
it's happening? It happens now. It happens in smaller scale now. I mean, I won't say that it's point for point exactly the same thing, but genocides happen all around the planet. Putin wants the Ukraine back because he says the Ukraine never existed separately. He's denying history. It's and we know these things. There's a writer named Clay Shirky. He's a journalist on economics and sociology, and he's younger than I am. Most everybody is. Anyway, and he says that institutions will try to preserve the problem to which they are the solution.
Yeah, and that's the big one, right? Because, and I think it comes back to that observation, right? Is if we view the Nazis as being monsters or animals, it's easier to have that division, have that separation, to view them as other, to view them as a thing. And I think that makes it easier to take action against them in a certain way.
Well, what does any military do? It dehumanizes the enemy. Why? Because that makes them easier to smash. Yes, the Nazis were a horror. The things that they did were abominable, execrable, but they were human beings. But their ideas were repellent and awful, and people got subsumed into it and swept up into it. Because an institution that was arising out of ancient institutions was saying, no, this is the way. And not in if let's go to pop culture again before we get to just everybody says, oh, no, we don't want to hear about, okay, so there's a show, The Mandalorian, right? And what's the common thing in Mandalorian culture, the phrase that they always say?
This is the way.
This is the way. But in recent episodes, and this, I'm not going to be a spoiler for people who are, but there's serious questioning about, is there more than one way for this to be the way? And so if this is the way, what is this? And is there a common this underneath all the other differences? That's deep stuff packaged in a Disney Star Wars thing. This is the way in the United States. What is the way? What do we really believe as opposed to what we say we believe?
Yeah, and anytime we try to, apply broad, categorizations, broad characteristics or categorizations to a group.
Yes.
I mean, that was the downfall that was the problem with the Nazis, right? Is doing that to other groups of people, to the Jews or to the blacks, and when you look at government issue, when you look at the political environment today and you see the government target, a certain political party targeting a group of people, that should always send up an alarm, right? Whether
yes, it should.
It's racial or based on, gender or sexuality or
politics.
Yeah, or even politics, right? The big movie that just came out was Oppenheimer, right?
Yeah.
And part of the backstory of that movie was Oppenheimer's involvement with the Communist Party, right? And McCarthyism and all of these different things that play into it. But I think that's the main takeaway from this idea of the power of social institutions is that philosophy is all about looking at categories and picking them apart until you realize that they're artificially constructed things, right? That are just meant to group things together. And that's what's needed when we're looking at these sorts of concepts, is not just the wholesale acceptance of the characteristics that are provided to a group. No, we need to break apart what it is about these groups that have things that should be protected or should be taken a harder look at, right?
Mm-hmm.
But so, given this, do you think an institution's foundations exert more explicit or implicit influence on people?
That's a really interesting question because both happen. When you say more, is it more explicit or implicit? I think to determine that, one would have to look at what's your context with the institution. Are you a worker within the institution and a member of the institution, or are you somebody who the institution is serving? And are those things different? If you're in a company, you're in a okay. So
I think this can be broken down across institutions, right? Because I think with businesses, it's almost always more explicit influence, right? The business that people work for usually doesn't have much impact on how they think about the world, but it definitely has an impact on how they act. They show up for work. They work 8 hours a day. They do a job. Whereas with a religious institution, right, that's where it gets kind of interesting because you could have people that are members of a religious institution that are deeply implicitly influenced by the institution.
Yeah.
And you might have others that have no implicit effect from the institution, but they're looking to get something else from it that's not necessarily religious. They want it to be a different type of social institution, one where they get together and they meet people and they do certain things.
Yeah, they want it to be social, or they want it to be transactional. I'll do this if you'll do that. The bargaining with God kind of thing.
Yeah, religion is an interesting run, right? Because you could have people on both ends of the spectrum, right? I think that if you're implicitly influenced, you're going to be explicitly influenced. I think that's, in a religious context, that's almost a given.
I think that is a given. Now, you're back to the company thing, because you're talking about a manufacturing company. I'm going to be talking about an educational institution. And there are different kinds of pressures. If an educational institution is having to adjust to a law which is written with vagary to be malignly, to be threatening, but to make you cautious about what you might think about teaching, rather than teaching from what you are trained and experientially given to know, and seeking more truth beyond that. But if there's this, but if you tread a little too far, we're going to fire you. That's not the same model exactly that's in the manufacturing world. However, I would assert that even in the manufacturing world, there are implicit, you can come for 8 hours a day, you can come and do your job. But even then, in some places, that's not good enough. How much more are you giving than the so-called minimum we're asking, when the minimum we're asking is 40 hours plus of your life and your health and your the whole dynamic as an individual, your identity must kind of align with us to some extent, or you're not a good fit anymore. Not all companies are that way, but clearly Starbucks is.
Yeah,
you know?
And I think that this is where we're getting into what we talked about at the beginning of the episode, which is the overlap of social institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, you could debate whether or not that's a good thing, right? Because you can imagine an educational institution that is also a business institution, and where that part of it is emphasized. You can imagine a religious institution that also emphasizes a business institution aspect, or a religious institution that emphasizes a political institution aspect.
Yeah, they
in my mind,
overlap.
I have a hard time imagining a scenario where the overlap of these institutions is results in a positive effect. I'm struggling to imagine.
Yeah, me too. Because the moment we slow down and think about what the institutions are explicitly about, but what they seem to be implicitly about, then there are serious questions. It doesn't mean that they're all wrong, and we go back to nihilism and say nothing. Let's have nothing. We need that. Libertarians want almost nothing. They're not far from nihilism, but there's a spot. There's a sweet spot in between. But if you say nothing matters, then you will enter that cynical or static spot that you talked about at the beginning, one end of the static scale. And so if our institutions, we believe in them enough to say that they can be better, that they can address things. Are companies willing to be better, or do they think they're at the top of the pinnacle and they don't have to listen to anybody? They can throw away workers because, after all, there are more workers. That's different than saying, you know what, we probably could do better, either with our resources or their time. But there are people within any company, whether it's a university company or a manufacturing company, that will say, yeah, we're going to do better because we're just going to make sure that we can do more with less, and even more with even less, and then everything with nothing. And now you're back to nihilism again.
Yeah, that's a really powerful statement, and I think that highlights it really well. Do institutions reflect collective or oligarchic will, do you think, on the whole?
Oh well. That depends on the level of the institution.
I think it depends on, coming back to what we were saying earlier, the life stage of it, right? When we think about these things as having a life stage.
Yeah, very good.
I think that the institutions always start with the will of the collective, but I think they always end with the will of the oligarchy.
If an institution lasts, and because you acknowledge the fact of the global reach that people are listening with us, all right, so small but important numbers of people here and there. I think if an institution, as you say, grows into its early senescence, then it even into its late middle age, it gets far too confident about itself and its path. And it's very easy at that point to say, well, our primary purpose is to make money for a few people. Our primary purpose to make money for a few people means that a lot of other people can be mistreated and barely survive on the wages that they have. But that's okay, because that's how it's supposed to be. Because it's, we live in a top-down society, which is what capitalism is about. It's about what every human socio-political model, sooner or later, I think, comes to. There isn't one that's across the board idealistically equalizing, unless the equalizing is to reduce people to the lowest possible means they can live within. because that's a method of control. Oh, I'm a Marxist now. No, if I am, fine. But it's not that simple. No ideology is fine if it becomes the ironclad ideology, which can never be questioned.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. And I think that, that it manifests itself in different ways through different institutions. But what I want to avoid, that maybe I haven't made clear thus far in the episode, is I don't want to posit that the will of the people is necessarily always the right thing either, because you can have situations where the view of the majority is actually not a view that is moral or is worthwhile, and so then that can cause. But I think that even in that case, that creates a self-perpetuating cycle in which the concentration of that view into the oligarchic will creates an even worse situation than it did if the collective will were demonstrated.
We make a mistake constantly about this idea of the will of the people, as if the will of the people is ignored if it's not entirely enacted. The all or nothing view. I think that's what we're dealing with in this attempt at more and more and more squeezing of people. Back to the idea of compromise. Nobody should have to compromise on the equality of human beings. To me, that's resolute. That anything that attacks that is wrong. It's not moral. And probably that was an overarching situation, the statement that people could tear apart too. But yet, no. We say majority rule. Well, what we mean by that is the majority of people who vote for things, vote for a person to be in office, would be in office. Majority of people in our country don't vote for that person. He shouldn't be in office, or she shouldn't be in office, or they shouldn't be in office. It's no more complicated than that. Now, we complicated in the system in a number of ways, but that's resolute also in our founding documents and systems.
Yeah, I think that a good example of this would be the higher educational system, right? Because if the will of the people is to be educated, then that's one thing. But if the will of the people is to have a piece of paper in order to obtain a job that pays them more money, and that's what they demand of the educational institution, then the will of the people is not correct, because it doesn't align with the purpose of the institution, which is to create and disperse knowledge. And I think the creation and the dispersal of the knowledge is a purpose, and purposes, by extension, have meanings, which means that they cannot be nihilistic.
Well said. Yes. And there is a misconstrual of some institutions through and by people who don't accept that that's what that institution is about. You can become extremely educated in any process, craft, profession, and you can become educated for the sake of being educated. But it's not all going to happen in the same institution. And this is where I think our culture would be much happier if it would leave universities to try to figure themselves out and continue to educate in the ways that universities were established, and have the constant questioning of internally of what is the truth and how do we get to it. That's the core. And we have institutions that teach plumbing, construction, electricity, computers, and so on and so forth. But it's all been mushed into the idea of college. And then it pushes away anything like the humanities in so many places now. No, we don't need that. That's old hat. We don't need gender studies. No, yes, we sure do. But that's because we gotta just make room for, we gotta have a job. Well, okay, it's noble, honorable, and necessary for us to have jobs. Nobody's saying jobs aren't important. But the training and the teaching and the work in a university are not primarily always first order about getting a job. It's about thinking. It's about developing your mind and your intellectual experience and your ability to Olympic proportions if you can get there. Not everybody can. Okay. But the primary goal is not to teach you to be a plumber or a statistician or an electrician as the first order of things. And when you tell people that universities as an institution really should be about saying, here are the only courses you need to take in order to know what it is you're going to go out and do your job with, the people who are fundamentally pushing that do not understand what a university is about. They do not understand what a college is about. And so the social pressure forces institutions to change because they take over an institution and try to remake it. This is no different than a virus invading a body and killing it or severely debilitating it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that there's, I think that's an important piece of the puzzle is that the collective will isn't necessarily always going to be moral or always aligned with the purpose of the institution, but also other social institutions are going to have influences that affect other ones. And again, education is a good example, right? Because, in the 1950s, the amount of funding that educational institutions got from the government allowed them to provide education in the root of what they were meant to do, which was to advance knowledge, to help people create will. Without any increase in funding, as we've seen, then an educational institution is necessarily forced to adopt a business model in order to ensure its own survival. And by adopting that business model, now not only do you have a bottom-up pressure from the collective, the will of the collective people to have job training, but now you have pressure from the top down, from a political organization to an educational system through the withholding of funding, forcing them to adopt a model that does not cohere with what the values and purpose of the institution is. So really in that case, when we philosophically, critically examine what is the purpose of an educational institution, and we look at what is being explicitly stated, like you mentioned earlier, right, in the mission statements, in the the things that set them apart, and on what's on the web page, right, of what they say they're doing, the explicit versus the implicit of what is actually being done, which is job training, right? You go, well, what are the foundations of this institution, and are they still intact, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's a good example, and I think that this has been a good conversation that's going to set us up for next week's. If, I know nihilism is a bit of a heavy topic. This has been a bit of a heavy topic. Next week is going to be fun. We're going to talk about how traditional views of media and entertainment are affecting modern media and entertainment.
Yeah.
So again, in the same vein of what we've been talking about today, but a little bit lighter, I think. Yeah. So until next time, keep pondering.